Thank you, Lynn. All right. Let me continue the program with the panel. So if I can have the panelists come up, have a seat. I was going to put you guys in a certain order because with this panel tonight, we're trying to, and by selecting you guys as panelists, and first of all, I want to thank you guys all for participating. So you drew a big crowd here, and it's awesome. So thank you. And by picking each of you, we tried to represent sort of the spectrum of design, sort of our feeble attempt to show that there's Pamela as a brand strategist and content strategist, and Marvin as a graphic designer but interaction designer, and Shad somewhere maybe in the middle of art and science. And I'm just taking liberty here, so if you disagree with me, please do. And a couple of big companies. So Tony works at a bigger company and manages a team of UX designers, and Theo's been a long time usability and UX expert as his own independent consultant. So try to get a mix of different people here, and you guys have their bios, so I'm not going to run through those here. You can read those in the brochure. And one of the things I was going to do that Lynn did, so all good UX designers have to poll the audience and see who's out there. We usually go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves and their title and their country, but we won't do that tonight because there's so many people here. But since we do know sort of who's here and what kind of people there are, I wanted to turn to the panel and ask you guys, we have such a broad representation of designers. How would you guys define UX design? Because one of the personal sort of rants I have is all the titles we have and all the definitions and processes, and we get so caught up in that when we try to define what it is we do to our colleagues, our parents, our brothers and sisters. They're often left scratching their heads. So anyone want to take a stab at defining what user experience design is, or interaction design, and is there a difference? Any? Yeah.
I'll start. Yeah. I think who cares? I mean, really, because when I started in automotive, I was doing one thing, right? And there was like a person for doing each particular thing to design a car. And then as I progressed in my career, it was like everybody started to kind of converge and started to do everything, right? So my background's in the 3D side of it. That's now on the 2D side of it, doing kind of the user experience thing and understanding how soldiers use systems, and it's kind of eye-opening, right? But title really doesn't hold. I mean, we all kind of do the same thing. Almost every one of us kind of raised our hands and said, yeah, I kind of do that, and I kind of do that. And it's like we're starting to wear one hat as opposed to multiple hats, doing more kind of a broader range of things.
Right.
So that's what who cares.
I think, well, so who cares, but I care. We'll go there. Actually, for me, user experience design is actually remembering that as you begin the work that you do, that you're doing it for someone. Someone has to actually sit down and use that thing. And too often, there's a lot of very brilliant people around an idea that just know, right? Oh yeah, if you want that, we can do that, right? And yet, the job of the user experience group is really to start to probe beyond the just, yeah, I heard you, and here it is. It's, well, for who, and what are they trying to do with it, and in what context we think. So, to me, that's kind of where user experience begins.
I got to follow up on that, Tony, because sort of coming from a brand perspective and then moving into the content, and how does the content, or what is commonly referred to as storytelling these days, how does it get expressed in terms of a task? So for me, user experience is where the brand meets the road, the rubber meets the road. It is where the brand has to conjure or inspire an action. And so when I think about experience, we used to talk about the emotion in the brand being the experience. Now we talk about this action. So experience is a very big word for me. Unfortunately, I sit with a lot of UX people, and they're over there, and in my head, content and UX belong inextricably, because we sort of are carving out these stories, and the stories, if they don't culminate in action that happens online in a digital universe, then what are you guys doing with the customers? So this is a bit of my pet peeve.
Well, where does brand start and user experience start? Where does
Well,
it begin and end?
that's a great.
Is it inclusive?
So.
The brand's bigger, right?
My opinion.
Hey.
That's a leading question.
Although, I mean, I was telling, just tonight, I had a conversation with a UX web designer guy, and he was a millennial. I've been around, I mean, I was trained in formal branding in New York, and I've worked in San Francisco. Actually, I've spent about half my career in California, and so I was talking about branding in the context of this web development thing we're working on, and he turned to me at one point, bored out of his mind, and he said, Pam, no one talks about the brand anymore. So I'm like, okay, I don't even want to take that on, but to me, the brand is ultimately the unifying principle. And so you have the method and the madness, which I know we're going to get into. The madness and the method are the yin and the yang of the creative process. But where's that whole yin-yang ball going? If it's not if the trajectory isn't with the brand, you will not have a client at the end of the day. You will not garner more budget. So for me, it's a guiding principle.
Would you say the user and the brand are starting to converge? I think they kind of are. I think one's starting to drive the other and vice versa.
If I were a user and you said that to me, I'd be offended. I'm not a brand.
No.
It's an
Not that
important
you
part
are.
of my being,
Right.
hopefully, but
One drives the other, and much more so in an internet society.
you think, you guys think that.
Um.
You kind of have to think that, but that's a little bit of an extreme kind of idealized world. But I guess a content person is the one who's going to ask the top-notch questions about what's really going on out there, what users really think. So I'm not seeing a lot of that,
What I mean by that is, a brand can say what it is,
right?
but a brand really is whatever people perceive it to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, if your
It's how they
market,
act,
if
not
your
what they
market
say.
is telling you what your brand is, you haven't done a great job branding, because you ended up with a default brand. People are telling you what they want you to be, but, I mean, ideally, there's a lot more thought and direction that goes into it, but, you know, budgets have moved off branding. I mean, when I left San Francisco a couple of years ago, you're getting this bifurcation. So you have digital agencies over here and brand agencies over there, and the two weren't talking. It's starting to get a little bit better now.
Well, the
but-
budget hasn't gone to UX designers.
No, I know.
Where has it gone? But,
Boy, I would fight for UX people. I mean, I
Theo.
really can't do my job without them, so
Right.
I agree.
Theo, what do you think is the difference between, you know, everyone used to talk about UI design. It was just UI design. And now, you know, the last 10 years is UX design. What's the difference between the two in your opinion?
Well, I'm come from more of a hardcore cognitive science, IBM era of doing research and developing products. Where before, it was user interface design.
Right.
And the name of my company is Interface Design Development. But the experience, just, you know, the words, you know, have expanded and they've gotten a lot fuzzier, but we're talking about such a wide range of things here where a lot of the applications I work on, there is no brand. If I'm working on, you know, I've written in air rescue helicopters and ambulances, designing software for a paramedic and a nurse, to try and keep that person in the ambulance alive. Brand doesn't matter to them. Sure. They want to do, and you've stuck a computer in their face, and they're trying to keep this person alive. So what my focus is on is making whatever it is, from, you know, a brand company website to more specific industrial commercial applications, whether they're web-based or, you know, software-based, trying to focus on the user and whatever their environment is out in the field. That's what's, and, you know, that's the user and the experience.
Right.
Trying to get them, you know, and without sticking more technology in their face and slowing them down. There are horror stories in healthcare of doctors and nurses and hospitals implementing these hospital-wide systems for millions, billions of dollars, and the doctors and nurses revolt and say, I can't use this. It
Right.
slows me down. You can't force a healthcare person to spend more time on a computer instead of what they should be working with the patient.
Have you looked at the Obama the healthcare
That's-
website?
That's one thing because
We're not going to get into politics.
actually the focus for each year for World Usability Day, there was a theme. And actually the theme this year is healthcare. We recycled it because in 2007, the theme was healthcare, and I actually was the World Usability Day overall person, and we did a lot of work. And it's fun. But you're right, we could spend the whole one evening talking about healthcare.gov, and the money that's been spent on that, and how unusable it is, whatever. But so, when I'm in the trenches doing that kind of work, I could care less about brand. It doesn't really affect me in that respect.
We suffer from the same thing at General Dynamics because we do the same type of products, right? We
Yeah,
do
you're
kind
right.
of faceless things that keep soldiers alive or keep the enemy dead, right?
Right.
Quite frankly. But that same thing is happening as kind of a backlash, right? So the soldier will be telling us, one of our competitors, we want you to be like that. And they're talking about brand, the look and feel, the experience, the whole thing. And so now brand is kind of kicking us in the butt. And it's like, well, now we need a General Dynamics brand, a look and feel, an experience, a consistent experience, right? And so now that's starting to resurface as a thing for us. And that's why I would say that, this UX tag that everybody wants to put on us, it doesn't really apply because now we're starting to move into brand for General Dynamics and trying to create this consistent thing,
Someone recently told me, he's a VP of design at Groupon. He said experience design is everyone's responsibility, not just a certain group.
Sure.
And I know, Tony, you were featured in UX Magazine in an article recently, and you had said UX is not UI design. You have to have those conversations all the time. What's your view on the difference?
Well, so I was giving Shad a little bit of a hard time with the who cares, because actually what he means is that really where you want to be in terms of your organization is that everybody's all in and understands that you're together in crafting the outcome, right? It's not, and that's the difference there, is that too many people will equate UX with the UI part of the design. You go here, right? So all this other work happens, and then we'll bring you in and you can do the UI. That's a fun thing to try to solve, but it's also not a great way to produce a great product. The user experience is kind of the underlying framework, what you do in the beginning to understand who you're designing for and what you're trying to accomplish. The work that you did to kind of vet your ideas with that, and everything else that went up until you actually were ready to start sketching and designing. Right? So to me, that's the big difference in what I meant, and that's what we fight actually a lot in user experience design is, oh yeah, you're the UI guy. Yeah, but how do you mean that?
Right,
Do you
right.
really know what I do?
Do you think that they say you're the UI guy because it's quantifiable, and UX is kind of this touchy-feely thing?
I think it's that in a lot of people's minds in terms of the method of how they work, the architects do things, the system designers do things, and then we bring in these guys.
Yeah.
But that's the mindset that needs to change,
Yeah.
So how many musicians do we have in the group? There's a few. So I was going to ask Marvin, your forte, I'm sorry, I had to do that, is graphic design and interaction design.
It's a
So for
music
your
term, too.
your
Means loud
musicians
music.
would get that loud, bold, play this thing loud. So it's a great last name and company name and a brand for yourself. So as sort of the more on the artistic side and graphic design side, what is your perspective in terms of the role that the artist plays, the visual designer, in relation to what everyone else just talked about, the science side of finding out what users are doing and wanting, and how to deliver an experience as opposed to an interface?
Well, we're supposed to just make everything pretty.
Yeah.
According to us.
And call in at the end, right?
Tell people this is pretty.
Yeah.
It's funny. Throughout my career, I guess I feel like there's less and less of myself in the work that I do, and I think that is user-centered design. That's really where that comes from. I've argued that if I do my job really well in creating an interface, or especially an interface or a website or something like that, people shouldn't notice me at all. I shouldn't look at it and say, oh, this is beautiful, look what he's done here,
Right.
that, and who did that?
Yeah.
And of course, that works against me, like using that as a portfolio piece to get work. But hopefully people don't notice what I do, and they just interface with whatever it is I built in a way that's intuitive and
So a lot of
That's-
UX designers say that too,
Right.
and that's fantastic. But I went to Pechacucha on Friday, or however you pronounce it. They scolded us at the event, but well, being harsh. But they, you know, there's nothing like, you know, some motion graphics or, you know, film or music to really bring the emotions out. And
Yeah.
where is that in user interface design or interactive design? Because I want some of that.
There's still room for that, and I think that's where brand comes into, depending on the brand. And what are you trying to evoke in that person?
Right.
You know, color, movement, all those things can evoke emotion, music,
Yeah.
more than any of them, I would
Right.
argue. So, but it's being appropriate, I guess.
Yeah.
I hate that word, but
Yeah,
I
you
try
can't,
and be
you can't
inappropriate as
overdo
much
it,
as I
because it's an interactive medium. But Tony, did you have a
Well,
question?
just, there was a stage in my career where I got to work a lot with graphic designers, and I missed the graphic designers, because as an interaction designer, information architect, kind of were this framework, and you needed that foundation that these guys would just bring that to life. And when they understood what you were trying to do, they could accentuate that. So I kind of think of it as if the composer wrote a piece of music, but then the musician, the artist, put the style, and you hear them play that music, and in your head it went one way, and it's still the song. It's totally recognizable, it fits, but they took it to a level you didn't expect. And that's what a great graphic designer can do, and I love partnering up with a good graphic designer to do that. That's, to me, what the style is.
Yeah, well put, well put. Shad, you have a BFA in industrial design. You also lead a visual design group at General Dynamics. How do you balance the art and the science and the method of madness, the process of General Dynamics? Can you talk about kind of how you guys work from a process standpoint?
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. They said our jobs weren't easy.
Yeah, it's particularly tough at General Dynamics because we have, well, it's DoD space department, but for a long time they don't care about interface, they don't care about style, they don't care about aesthetics, they don't care about any of that stuff. They don't even care if it works, to tell you the truth. And the truth is, right? Soldiers are used to getting equipment that doesn't work, and then they have to live with it, right? And they're getting shot at life or death situations. That's the long and short of it. So we continually strive to get design or aesthetics or even simple things as wayfinding, right? We have no brand, so we can't get that there, but we really try to justify what we do by using business terms. So I always tell my guys, you know, if you're going to do something, we have to justify that to the business guys. We have to speak their language. So as opposed to come up with something that looks good, we have to say, well, we developed various wayfinding techniques to bring this iconography to life so that the soldier could go through this workflow easier. And then we'll have to quantify that by saying instead of using 28 steps, we used 5 steps, and because this icon's here and this color means this, and right, so there's also DoD standards for color and everything like that, so we have to abide by those things. So we really have to justify using the business terminology, nomenclature, whatever, to our business partners, our directors of finance, our directors of international business, our directors of business development, people like that that have no clue what we do, but they trust us to make a better product. A lot of times we'll have to say, well, now you get repeat business. And that's all we have to say, and then they're like, yeah, fine, here's some more money,
All right.
So a lot of times it's that simple, but.
Okay.
Wow, has it really been that easy?
So what sets user-centered design apart from any other design discipline is that it is human-centered, I think. And I read a quote once that said, how much user research are you doing? The answer is not enough. And Theo, what is the importance of that? And what I think most people that are not trained in human factors or cognitive psychology or human-computer interaction don't get trained in those research methods. And as a result, as designers, we don't do enough of that. What is the importance of that, and how do you bring that to bear?
With my background, that's one thing I've been focusing on for 20 years. Getting a master's psychology, I was doing research in graduate school, and I've been doing it ever since. And going into companies where they say, I know what the user wants. Build it.
Right.
Saying, you don't even know who your user is, you've never seen them use your product. And that's what, the most joy I get is when I do a usability study and I force the designers, the developers, and the executives to sit back there in the observation room and watch real people using their product. It's just amazing, their reaction. It's like, oh, that guy's an idiot. You know, he's not pressing the button's right in front of them.
Right.
They don't have a clue about their user. And it goes back to even business requirements. As a consultant, I go into situations, all right, they just dump the business requirements. Here's the business requirements, go build it.
Right.
Well, every business requirement I see, you know, I don't believe it until I
Sure.
look at it, investigate it, and go back and make sure it could be some executive who just said, hey, that's what I think that requirement should be. You don't know how those requirements came about, if they were user justified, user researched, but doing usability research throughout the whole product cycle is one of the most fulfilling things to be done. Like I the last couple of years have been consulting with Pearson Education, and it's so much fun. I have kindergarten kids, and we bring in to do usability tests. You get them on a tablet, on an iPhone or whatever, and they do the test. I have parents come in. We have teachers and administrators. So every user of that piece of software, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a child, whatever, and getting the design team involved in watching that every session.
Sure. What about research methods on, say, a novel interface, maybe something that doesn't exist? You know, so how do you go out and find out what people want prior to building something? And maybe, Pamela, from a brand perspective, there's market research techniques, focus groups, and stuff like that. But they're often in not conflict, but user research is much deeper usually and asks more specific questions, but it's usually based on observation. What about the research methods prior to designing or building something that doesn't already exist? What do you guys?
You mean
Like
paper prototyping?
ethnography.
Are you talking about?
Just
I mean, I love paper prototyping.
anything maybe
Yeah.
of going. Well, I'm talking more about users. How do you do the human research? Say your company wants to get into a new area and it's a brand new product. So before you start prototyping or building something or have anything to usability test, what are some of the research methods that any of you use prior to that to find out what do people want, or like Theo said, who are the people that we're getting to?
Isn't the hardest thing just to get people to think outside of what they already think?
Some
I mean,
people, for sure.
It's really tough.
But it's what Theo said, it's asking lots of questions
Yeah.
about
Right.
who and why, and it's hard. You have to ask the questions in different ways. I have to ask the same question in different ways. And eventually I'll ask in the right way, and it'll spark something, and it'll come out. And sometimes it takes weeks or months to go through that process and learn. And that's brand too. I mean, that's the same exact thing with brand.
It's actually for me, it comes under what I call innovation strategy, which is a whole other kind of discipline that, as you say, you have to ask a lot of questions, but it enlists so many business levels of an organization, and there's so many budget parameters. So yes, all the traditional understanding and approaches we got to market research could potentially play in, but when you're investigating a new area, innovation is a process unto itself. So, I mean, UX people are not even at that table. In my experience.
I'm not a panelist,
So-
but I might disagree with you there. But
Please.
we'll get into that later.
I wanted to say something
Tom.
on that. You're asking kind of how much research, and there's actually coming up on the gift giving season. There's an analogy I've used with my folks where we talk about as somebody who's received a gift, right? There's sometimes that you're always polite, you're always friendly, but there's sometimes the feeling of it's the thought that counts, right? And there's those kind of gifts. And then there's the wow, how did you know, right? Those gifts, how did you know? And the difference in the research, and this is the questions, is you can find out the information to get to that level of understanding of your user, your customer, of the how did you know. That means talking directly to them, but they're only going to tell you so much. Just like, if you're going to buy a gift for, I don't know, a family member or a new girlfriend or whoever it may be, you know, you can ask them to tell you a little bit, but then you ask their best friend, or their mom, or their cousin. You start to build more information, and pretty soon you kind of know your area, where you're gonna go, and then you add your own ideas, and that's when you get there. But getting to that level of understanding, which is more of an intuitive thing to do, is actually the key.
Yeah, I don't know, because, I mean, in a sense, you got the unmet needs, sort of needs analysis, and sort of bingo, we figured out what people need, or what was really surprising to like them, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
Well, it's taking all that, but then it's adding your
Right.
input into that. I know all of this, and now I'm gonna go get this decision. The
Your
last
film.
part ingredient of you is you.
So going back to, in my experience and having been a creative director, the toughest job I had was essentially selling the creative. So just by definition, if it really is creative, it's original. And if it's original, people are gonna hate it. And they're gonna hate it for a simple reason. They've never seen it before. And when anybody is confronted with something they've never seen before, they instinctively shut down, because it makes them feel stupid. So you almost have to go in and find a way to tell them what this is, what this really means. You talk at a meaning level, so when they see it, it syncs up. So my experience is, yeah, it's, the unmet need is very important, but sometimes you're identifying an unmet need they've never thought of. It's never even been, like, think about the iPad.
Well, that's a great difference between, I think, where we're at in the process too. I mean, sitting down into that car and having it just work versus seeing the new Mustang,
Mhm.
you know, and that's kind of your realm would be that introducing that thing that they haven't quite understood how much they love it yet.
So for me, it's like the design team has to translate that into an experiential, a tactical, a visual, a total sensory experience.
Yeah.
So that, like the iPad, again, intuitively you just got it. And then it seamlessly became part of your life, and now you can't live without it, kind of thing.
There's a couple different types of design. There's evolutionary design. We have products and you're doing new versions and it takes its natural evolutionary course. There's other products where it's revolutionary design, where nothing has been done like this before, and then it's different types of activities. You've got to figure out, because nobody's seen it before, you know, like you said with the iPad or something else, you know, how do you get them to give you feedback for it?
And that's sometimes where the research works against, it can work against it.
Yeah.
The analytics can tell you that people are not responding to this, but that's what a good designer does, is they're able to see ahead and say, no, this is going to work.
Well, when we do user research, you know, we always say, listen to your users, but then do what's right. Because your users may not, the old Ford story, you know, we ask people what they wanted. They wanted a faster Ford.
Yeah.
Which may or not be true.
It's a good story.
You do want to listen to your users, but you still, that's part of the whole equation. You don't do exactly what they say necessarily. You take that with all the business needs and knowledge and design, and then you do what's right. So you listen to the users, and then do what's right. It may match up very well. It may, if it's more revolutionary design, they may not give you enough of a picture to, you know, tell that need.
We'll talk about innovation a little bit later, but I wanted to open it up to the audience. If they have any questions at this point about the different role of designers, design process, some of the things that the panelists already talked about that maybe I didn't ask them, and if you have any questions, raise your hand, or maybe you want to contribute something to that, be fine. Anybody? All right, go ahead, I think you were first. then
I
go
guess
John.
I can also defer to the gentleman, it's fine. Just a personal interest, but kind of to your point about user research methods, I'm kind of curious if any of you champion, use, letting consumers or users create their own solutions, and how you kind of can extract meaning, to your point, from that process. So it's just curious if any of you do that, or want to tell a story.
I do, for sure. I try to. You know, that's kind of back to what Theo was saying. You can't shut that down. Like, it's really easy as to put on your designer hat, and somebody starts giving you this idea that you know is flawed, and you look at it and you just go, this isn't going to work. But you're shutting down exactly what you're trying to promote, which is that collaboration to learn more about what they need. And so I try and do that, and then I say, this is great. I'm going to take this into account. And then, like Theo said, you may not do what they said, but you're going to take it into consideration and hopefully come up with something better.
But it does influence people.
It should.
Yeah, you know, hear from the users, they may be right or wrong, but it's going to influence you. I mean, it's going to bias you one way or another, and that's, I think, the whole point.
That also goes into prototyping. A lot of business people are afraid to put something in front of an end user without it looking good. They're afraid it's going to present a bad image on the company. But research has shown that if you give users something that's less concrete, that doesn't look like a finished product, you're going to get more conceptual, more open, more intuitive, and more thoughtful feedback from them. So it's counterintuitive. You don't want to give them something that's finished, because then they'll say, well, yeah, it looks kind of nice, it's okay. If you give them something that's more sketchy, or paper, or wireframe, or something like that, they know it's not finished, it's not final. So they're more likely to give you creative feedback on it. So that's why the earlier low fidelity and early prototyping and early testing is good.
You know, and the interesting thing about the low fidelity stuff is that, you know, all of us in the room have the skill set to start to shape that into something that works towards a solution. You know, the person that's going, your user is not necessarily going to have the skill set to give you this really pretty interface or really well thought out idea, but you're going to have that aha moment, and that's where we take it and use our expertise to move that forward and give them something that's similar to what they want or exactly what they want or something they never thought of.
All right. John, I think you have the next question.
Yeah, I enjoy the branding conversation. I think it's very interesting. I kind of come from the standpoint or thinking that the experience that you're building for your product is your brand. And I think, whether you realize or not, whether you don't care about the brand, you have one, and it's that experience. So I mean, Theo, if you're developing medical stuff, you have an ambulance worker who is, can't use this thing, that reflects negativity in you.
Yeah, what's the feeling of interfacing with whatever it is? To me, that's like the definition of the brand. It's like, what does this feel like?
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, and I forget who said it. The two experiences were, I think you said it, Wayne, where everyone can, no one will notice a good experience because it just works well, but everyone will notice a bad experience.
Oh, yeah.
And what does that do to your brand? Take the healthcare.org. I mean, how hurt is that brand? Because that website is so confusing. That's my point. That's
That's not, you get one, and maybe there was one in the back there too.
My question is all of the except for Pamela.
Exclude.
Yeah, my question to all of you is how you started your careers. Have you started as a UI, UX designers, or have you started as something completely different? I'm really, because I come from the academia. So, but my question related to that would be, how do we educate today's generation, to come to this level where you are, when they finish school? Because as you know, there are very few interaction design or UI or human computer interaction design, really good schools in the States. So that's my question.
Great question.
Yeah. So, I know you come from the industrial design world, right?
Yeah, I mean, my first job was at Articat design
There
snowmobiles,
you
so
go.
most people probably don't know what snowmobile is here, but I said most. But when I got there, I was the guy, and I had a couple product lines that I had to make real from scratch. And we didn't have a human factors person. We had a graphics person, but they did the decals, right? They weren't real graphics people that made things look pretty. They made checkerboards and the flames and stuff. And so I had to start filling those roles. I started learning that, wow, there's a user to this thing. I started going to the focus groups, which were extremely, in this case, extremely biased. We had farmers come in when they used a different type of a snowmobile, right? I started to understand how focus groups work and bring in users for different reasons. And I really didn't understand at the time that I was kind of creating this experience of the snowmobile, which I lived, right? I didn't even realize I was one of the users, right? So that kind of started shaping that and started moving me away from just product design to now looking at what this whole thing means, what this experience is, not just a product, but what goes around it. And iTunes was kind of, I think, my first, look at that, because it was like, wow, you have, the, what do you even call it anymore? Not the iPhone, but the iPod, thank you. I only
Already
had like 6
forgotten.
of them. You had the iPod, but that was only real because you had iTunes, and then you had a store that you could buy things from. And I was like, wow, this whole ecosystem exists around this product. And I was like, well, is it the product, or is it the stuff that supports that? Or what is
That's a
it?
really good response.
I want to extend the question as it goes down to Marvin and say, not only where, how you got to be where you're at, but what skills do you think are important? I know we have some students in the audience too, and all designers are trying to learn new skills. So what skills do you guys all think is also important as part of your learning?
Yeah, the skill for me is just questions. It's just always questioning everything and trying not to take things for granted. That's what I think is my ninja skill for sure.
Right.
I started in graphic design. I back far enough back that it was galley type and a waxer and border tape and X-Acto knife and doing everything by hand. And so it was a very tactile thing. And then my boss got a computer and said, here, figure out this desktop publishing thing. Figure out how to do that. So I figured it out and started knocking out stuff digitally. And I got away from the tactical more, and that pendulum swings back and forth because I try and keep that in what I do. But doing graphic design, I started to, I think, experience some of the things that you do with UX design, really. But I think it was when I started doing websites, really, that I felt like I was touching, and that was about, 88 started doing graphic design, 98 started doing print design, or web design rather. And that's when I started thinking about the user a little bit more. And trying to, the other kind of skill in that too is being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Looking at something that you know intimately and looking at it with naive eyes is a real skill.
Pamela?
I'm not allowed to talk.
Sorry.
So,
Theo. I'll ask you another question to be fair.
Can
as
we,
a compensation.
I'd like to address at some other point what are missing in some of the education.
Okay.
So, continue your question.
So I'm probably the more traditional human factors, user interface design person. My background, I got my master's and I got undergraduate in psychology, master's and PhD in quantitative cognitive psychology. In the early days before this field and industry existed. Actually, when I went to graduate school, I wasn't driven to do something when I was done with graduate school. If I would have finished on time and not been a graduate student versus a graduate student, I would have had to stay in academia. There really wasn't anything else for someone with a PhD in cognitive psychology to do but teach and do research. But actually, I was working with Walter Kinge, who did reading comprehension. And actually, another professor who was in the child development area had just gotten an IV monitor system. And this was in the 80s. And since my advisor were looking at reading comprehension, we actually would analyze texts, let people read the text, and there was nothing we could do during the reading process, but afterwards we would have them summarize stories, or Tony tells me what he thought the story was, and I tell Pamela, and it goes on, and we can analyze what was contained and what was left out, and that's how we built our theories of reading comprehension. Well, this neat machine came into our university department, our psych department, and I was tasked with trying to figure out if we could use that in helping figure out what was going on in reading comprehension. So I did early studies, both my master's and PhD, looking at eye movements in reading. And it's a really neat, and I ended up with now the IV monitor systems are incredible. You get so much data, you just punch a button, you get everything, you get the heat maps and all that. When I was doing that, I had to write all the programs to capture all the data. I would end up with a punch card for every single eye fixation that every single subject in my research made. So I had drawers and drawers of punch cards, which none of you remember. But actually, by the time I finished my degree, this is in Boulder, Colorado, there was an IBM plant there that did printers and copiers. They were starting to realize in industry that people couldn't use their machines, that they were unusable. but they had to buy them because there was only one type of copier that they could use that worked for them. So once they realized that they had competitors whose products were maybe better and easier to use and cheaper and needed less support, they started to realize that we have to design our products better. And who do we find help us design these products but these people who know how people think and learn and read and comprehend, these so-called cognitive psychologists. So that's kind of how I was lucky enough to be, the timing worked out so that I ended up getting a job at IBM and kind of rode the wave of usability and
What skills do you think are important for people coming up now to learn?
One of the things in presentations, if some of you were at the UIE conference we did in the spring, one of the presentations I've been doing for a lot of years is the golden rules of design. There are lots of things that we do or we should do to our users. And it's not enough to just know what the rules are, like you don't use this font, or you don't use that color, or lots of rules about how people's brains think and memory, and being consistent and letting the user be in control and those kinds of things. But it's not good enough to just know what some of the rules are and the guidelines. It's to know why, like you said, why. And ask questions like, if I tell a client, you shouldn't use that font, well, what happens if they say why? I've got to justify that. Well, it's because. It's common sense. Well, it's common sense. It's not common sense. It's not common sense. It's common sense. But there's research. There's topography. There's sans serif fonts. There's readability issues. There's behind every design advice or design principle we promote and use in our design, we should be able to justify with our own experience, with ROI, with research, with the history of typography or graphic design or color, whatever. That's why you need this wide range of skills.
Sure.
But what drives me nuts is when people say, yeah, you shouldn't be using that color or that font. And if somebody asks them why, they wouldn't have a clue.
Right.
So that's why, given my academic background going into industry, a lot of people who've gotten into the field from other areas, it's fine, but you need some basis of understanding about the research and the history and
The psychology
of
human
design.
perception and
Yeah.
cognition.
Right.
Tony, how about, why don't we let Tony have a chance to?
So skill side is actually a really interesting part of this conversation, and you're hearing over and over the ability to talk to people, all kinds of people. It's actually probably something that can be easily missed in the course of education is, can I talk to the architect and actually find meaning and understand? Can I talk to a marketing person? Can I go talk to the CEO who's this crazy personality, and then can I go back down and talk to customers and the clerk who works at the store or whatever, depending on it is. The ability to have that's actually the X factor in the interview, and I always look for is somebody who can kind of get along, be comfortable with all these different things, because that's where you're drawing all of your meaning and all your information. Analytical, so once you get that information, you can't just lump it in a big pile in the corner. You actually have to kind of make some sense of it and put it together in ways to draw out, okay, what did I just learn from all of this? And let me look across these.
So where do you come from, originally?
Originally, Ann Arbor, Michigan. No.
Okay, gotcha.
Get that a lot out here in Arizona.
Yeah.
Nobody's actually from. My first technology experiences were actually, I was a webmaster. I was in the horse racing industry, the daily racing Forte. And I had worked in their copy desk. I had worked in advertising.
You have horse sense.
I have horse sense, yeah. And the thing is, we were a data center. The daily racing Forte, what you don't understand is they compile all of the past performance data, all of them. I could tell you a lot, but they were the data source. That's why people bought that paper. News and things were secondary. And so we had contracted with a lot of different places, a lot of different tracks and news agencies, OTBs. And pretty soon we became a web hosting agency. And so that was just a crash course. And that's the other part. You have to be able to learn people's businesses, right? What do you do? Who are your customers? What's your identity? And be able to understand that and then translate that online, right?
So I want to shift gears and pivot just a little bit here, the conversation to UX strategy and process. And Shad, you and I had a brief conversation. You were talking about how important a robust process is. And we have people from branding strategists, content strategists, usability experts, graphic designers. If you all were on a team and starting on a new project, what is the process that you use? How do you guys work together? who does what? Who starts? How do you collaborate? What's a process do to?
We would make an awesome team, I'll have to say.
I mean, is it user-centered design? Is that the process? I mean, I see all these diagrams and maps and tours and looking, kind of processes, and they're all.
Those charts drive me crazy.
There's just all kinds, but.
The arrows and, yeah.
Gotta have them.
So what, from a process standpoint, what do you guys use
That's
as
all you
general?
need to know.
Yeah, the Monopoly board,
Yeah.
right. It's so easy to follow.
I see myself as kind of the filter and the facilitator.
Mhm.
Like, all those people should be circled around me because no, because I'm taking all that in, and then sort of what Tony was saying, putting it through my filters and figuring out what that really means. Like, I'm supposed to be the one who takes all these disparate ideas and goes, oh, I see this relates to that, to this, to that, and I can put it together.
You're talking about, as a designer, working with other disciplines,
Not just
or
as a-
other designers as well.
Yeah, I'm talking about everybody. I mean, I think we've got to get the client, if there's a client, and all the team working from the beginning on everything. That's where we've got to get to, because this idea of handing something off to somebody and them going away and woodshedding on it and bringing it back and then looking at it going, I don't get it. What is this? If they're involved and engaged in the process of making all those design decisions with you,
Right.
then there's nothing for them to refuse later.
Won't you say that happens a little bit later? Because where's your expectation set? I mean, you can't go into a project and say, hey, here's your design, right? Or here's our team. I think you have that front person that goes in and says,
The
this is what we're-
research, for sure.
Well, even before that.
Oh, you're saying,
Yeah, I'm saying at the very start of the project, you need somebody that comes in and says, what do you want? And they're gonna say, well, we kind of want this. Well, here's what we're gonna do for you, right? And
well, I don't know. I would disagree with that, because I think that's what goes wrong most of the time with classical graphic design projects, is a client comes in and says, I need a brochure, or I need a website. And the first question I ask them is, why do you need a brochure?
Right.
And so you
Because
start
I want to
set
get more
expectations,
business.
right?
Well, maybe a brochure is the right way to go, but maybe it's.
That's critical, and yeah, it's the pivot. I mean, for us, it's the I need a button, or I need, whatever it may be. But I always agree, yeah, great, of course we'll get you a button. Now, what do we get this button for? You probe, because it's probably maybe a 10% chance that the button is really what they needed. But you draw that information out, and that's where the skills of the experienced designer come.
But you're not gonna bring the whole design team in right away, too. That's not, I don't think that's the
No,
start
not
of
at
the
that
process.
stage.
Yeah.
Not at that stage. I'm talking
It's
about right
that
after.
front-end negotiation, expectation setting, and then reciprocating that, and then, here's your kind of where we're gonna start. Right, here's our process.
I am curious, so for us, the absolute very beginning is what are we designing and who are we designing it for? And then we know a lot of what to do based on what we get out of those. What else do you guys have beyond that, or do you start somewhere else?
Well, again, you're not gonna, somebody's not gonna approach you and say, we need a brochure, or, here's the people you're gonna be designing for. That's what you were saying before, it's kind of that feeling that person out and negotiating with them to understand, asking the questions, the right questions, even the wrong questions, to get a response, right? And then you can start to form what that kind of thing is, that expectation. And then, to your point, the method part of it would be that process. Whether or not you follow it, it doesn't really matter, but to some people, that really makes a difference. They're gonna expect 100 sketches and then, kind of bring that, the art school mentality, bring that down to 5 and then really refining the last 3 or whatever it may be. You're setting an expectation and saying, here's our process that we're gonna do for you. Internally, like I said, you may or may not do that process, but at least they know what to expect now. So,
Can I jump in? Because for me, it really depends. Are you talking sort of agency world where you're working at the brand level or the bigger level and you're starting to say there, or are you on a project? Arizona is a lot of projects, I find. I've been fortunate that I've been able to work on some big brands with real budgets. And then you have a situation where, you have the particular kind of chaos that each team generates, as well as their own particular kind of process or methodology. and nobody's really talking to each other, or eventually the creative director's job is to get people on the same team, working, say, with the digital strategist, the brand strategist, then you get a content strategist. It's like, it's like Tower of Babel sometimes, just trying to make sure we all, because you talk about listening, that was a great point, but a lot of times we're not listening to people on our own. So, coming out of the agency world, everyone knows that this is being just a total meltdown time for agencies. They haven't figured out a new business model, and then you get these digital companies that are trying to own the brand, but they don't really, now they have to start hiring brand and content strategists. And I have such a pet peeve about that word strategist, because to me, the brand is the strategy. Implicit how you define your brand is the strategy. And so when a content strategy says to me, well, I'm a content strategist, and they've never done any kind of formal branding or really understand what's involved there, I'm like, what is the strategy part of your content? You're basically curating and organizing content right now, or coming up with stories that you think generate conversations, because brands also have become the sum total of the conversations that are going out there, which I think somebody alluded to earlier. It's what people are saying about you. It's just that, you really missed the point, but anyway, I don't know what I was saying, except that.
Well, let's move through. So there's a whole agency and content, brand and website side of things. The other side is the software company, software development.
Right.
Tony, your company does Agile, so every UX designer is soon going to be working in an Agile environment. Scrum seems to be the most popular method. How does UX fit into a Scrum method? And what, again, sort of looking back to the process question, is it just the user-centered design process that you use, or is it a lean UX or agile UX and all these sort of new process things, and how do you integrate that with an agile software development method?
Well, that's an easy one to
We have 2 minutes. Go.
Well, first of all, it is actually very interesting. It's a segue because I've worked in the agency world, and brand is a component in an influencer. I do love that conversation too, to talk about the relationship between the two. But you're making me realize that those days are now. I am on projects. So for us, the brand is the brand, and I do tend to work a lot more on projects. So that's the first thing, is that really, as I start to talk about this, it is about user experience design is applied to what are we designing, who are we designing for? Because that other stuff is kind of solved. We know what that is. We have an identity. We know our customer. Now we're trying to figure out what's unique about this thing we're doing. Within the actual development practices, I tell you that what that did is it just kind of, it broke it up and scattered the pieces in the sense of what you do in usability and in user experience design. But it actually worked out okay for me. In my career, I was actually kind of drawn to user experience design because I kind of liked the idea of one of the first agencies I worked at, where we were built up to individually have the talents and the tools to be able to go out to any customer and start to understand their business, their systems, their customers, what they were trying to do, and put it together. And so if you build your team in a way that each of your team members who are scattered out there in their sprint teams, kind of, they're cowboys. They're out in the Wild West, but they're self-sufficient. They've got a number of tools and talents, and as these projects are thrown at them, the one thing we have universal is we call the questions. And there's several of them at the phases of the project. And as long as you get those answered, you are on your way. And the way you answer them is in multiple different techniques, depending on what's known or not known. If we know the customer, then we may have the persona already. It's totally new. We got some work to go do, right? And on. Technology, so on and so forth.
I'm curious about the Scrum with you guys. Do your designers do well within the Scrum? Because I played rugby and Scrums are not.
I got some tough designers. In fact, the guy from Ireland he plays rugby.
So he knows.
Yeah. But they've done tremendous. In fact, what I was telling some folks out there is that I started off as a pure design function in the company. And yet the team members grew into product owners. They actually became leaders of their teams because they had that unique combination of knowing technology, being very detail-oriented and organized, knowing customer, and being able to talk to a lot of people. So when it came time, they just were natural leaders in that environment. And thank goodness, they were user-centered, so they actually incorporated the customer.
Sure.
What I'm seeing a lot of though is the agile as a development methodology. You came to it from design first, then they became product owners.
Right.
The problem is if they're product people who don't know UX, don't know design, don't know usability, focus on agile as a development methodology, it doesn't say anything about the design. When do you do design? You do the same sprint, you do an earlier sprint, when do you do your user testing? When do you do your user research? So it's not a design methodology, it's a development methodology. And if you don't figure out how to do that in parallel or intertwine,
Right.
he did it well because he came at it from a design perspective and
Yeah.
then focused on product.
Isn't Lean UX an attempt to force fit?
Again, this is another,
It's a
terminology.
software development process, and it never accounted for design. You're exactly right.
Right. Well, basically, what we're trying to do is, in the old days, development cycles were long. In web years, we can't do that anymore. Our development cycles have to be much, much shorter.
Yeah.
And to do that, we have to become, and iterative is something we've been just working towards, that's one of our key words. It's
Right.
gotta be iterative. You can't just go to the user once, you've gotta go back and do it iteratively. You don't just test once, you test numerous times in a cycle.
Right.
We're condensing development cycles into, instead of years for, when I was at IBM, it would take 2 or 3 years to develop a product. And by the time you built it, nobody wanted it anymore.
And it didn't work.
And it didn't work, right? Yeah, of course.
Because, most people don't have that ability to visualize something. We can sit down and draw thumbnail sketches and think about how it's gonna work and go, yeah, I see how that would work.
Yeah.
But usually the person on the other side of the table doesn't get that. They're gonna have a really hard time with that. So that's where Agile is great, because you can build something that kind of sort of works, and they can look at it and go, well, that's cool, but what if it did this? And you go, oh, okay, great, yeah, let's change it.
The concept of an MVP, a minimally viable product, is I think one of the best things that's happened with it. It focuses on doing small pieces instead of building this monolith of a product with all the functions, all the features, all the UI, all the graphics, all the branding. You can't release something until it's this big, complete product. I think now that we're doing it in much shorter cycles, we come up with this concept of you don't have to do it all in one release. You don't have to do it all in one sprint. You can do these MVPs and get this piece of it right, and then move on to the next piece, or take this part
So
of it.
those are all good things, right?
Yes.
So Lean Startup is great because you get those pieces in chunk, and Scrum is the way to help build those pieces. But even in Lean Startup, there's no design. It's build, test, learn, and iterate. So the iteration part is good. The small chunks are good. The quick sprints are good, but
But you've got to figure out how to
Still-
get design in that.
yeah,
build.
and if you're doing little pieces, little sprints and chunks, who's like you said, who's got the big picture of where that's going to end up, as opposed to when you get there, it looks like dog food.
Because it's decentralized. Agile is kind of decentralized.
Do you
and so
guys
where
know
does
about the community of practice concept, right? Or centers of excellence? Did anybody use those? You're in that, right? So the idea is that although they're decentralized, because that's the issue, right? But we actually, within the mention, right? So the idea is that even though they're all out there sitting apart from each other and with their teams, we actually have a very strong community of practice, which is kind of what this group represents. People who do the same job throughout the company who come together to talk about doing that job. And we actually identify needs. Oh, if we're going to develop this across 4 offices and it's one suite, it needs to gel together, it needs family. Let's get the design standards in place. And let's figure out a method to force them to evolve, right? But then how do we go about getting customer information? And we only service this body of users, so let's get a library of personas around them, and then we'll just add to it. But you have to have both. Yeah, if you just set those cowboys out on the range, never to see each other again, they may
Until I
go
understood,
native on you.
until I understood the agile process better, and it came from the development world, I thought for sure it came from the creative world. Because if you draw our process, it's like, hey, I draw something and I iterate on it, and then I build like a prototype, and then I come back and it's
Test
refine
it
it.
with customers.
That's
Yeah,
classic
that's
design
what-
thinking, definitely.
Right, and so that's where I thought it came from until
Yeah.
I read about it. I'm like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. So, wasn't sure where you were going with that.
I wasn't sure either.
Because I was going to go, yeah, no, but you're absolutely
I don't know
right.
what-
So what,
Can we ask questions
No. That's just-
Because you gotta relate to what they do.
Please,
All right,
it's
thank
just
you.
short, as long as the answers are short.
Yes, it's gonna be very short, because this is the question for Theo. When you set up this really great conference this spring at PayPal, you had this really great presenter that I was very interested in, when he was talking from New York from PayPal, I don't remember his name now. But-
Rich Tolman?
Yes, it was really fabulous. So he talked a lot about the life cycle of the product. And he also talked about how we really, as designers, the company don't have the luxury to go through like thousands of iteration process because of the competitive market. So, you know, and specifically you, Theo, how do you kind of wage that battle, if you will, you know, and what cost in order to really resolve the problem, you know, within the time frame? Because I just kind of have a feeling that we could be losing some of the quality along the way because of that pressure of the market.
Sure. The basic question is kind of how much and how often do you iterate? Again, you've got a box. You've got to work with it. You've got a certain budget. You've got a certain amount of time, a certain amount of resources, and you have to figure out, you know, how many iterations is the minimum acceptable criteria.
And the maximum.
And the maximum, right, right. Well, it's also the discussion we've had in usability testing. How many users do you test?
Right.
You have to go get 40 users in the study. No. Nielsen, you know, there's been lots of studies that show you get, and especially if you're one running the studies, you get to the point where you know where they're going to stumble. You know that this is a common area. You get a few unique things from each person, maybe, but the common areas you can get between 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people.
Okay, so
You
that's
know,
depends.
so there's research in some of those things, but also some of that is the client's, the environment. You know, how much time, how much money, how much resources do you have? Also, how well established is the product, the platform, the users? If it's well established, then you may not have to iterate as much. If it's a new niche, you know, a sea change that you're doing, it's a totally new kind of thing, new technology, new users, then you may have to iterate a little more because you don't quite have the baseline there. It's a typical consultant's answer. Well, it depends. My
Yeah.
3 favorite words.
Absolutely. And then you can charge more money, of course.
Thank you, Ryan.
So, thank you. And so, switching maybe gears just a little bit again, and let's talk about visual design and UX trends. What's up with flat design?
I was talking to somebody about that back there.
You know, I mean, I've seen some really, really good flat designs. I love the minimalist, you know, aspect of it and the cleanness of it and the focus on content. But I hate iOS 7. I mean, I think they just did some things really wrong. What do you think, Mark?
I like iOS 7.
Yeah.
There's some things I think they need to fix,
Yeah,
but I think
sure.
generally, it's funny, what I was saying in the something before we started is, 7 years ago, I was pitching pretty flat designs to people because I knew that's the way things were going. So we were starting to build things that we didn't call it responsive then because that term hadn't been coined, but as we were building sites that flexed, we knew we needed to make things more flat and more scalable. And we would give those proofs to clients. We would try and get them
Let
to
me
say
guess,
yes.
they didn't like them?
And they'd say, it's got to pop. You see
Gotta
this
pop.
side here that's got all this shading and,
Yeah.
and this intro and all this stuff. And it's, you know, the pendulum swings. And so the
Yeah.
pendulum swung way too far towards this eumorphism, shaded gradient stuff where people finally reacted and went, oh, I'm sick of that. And now the pendulum is swinging way back the other way, too far maybe,
Probably, yeah.
towards flat. And it'll come back to the middle again.
Well,
That's
you
my
see
take.
a lot of websites, right? You'll see a certain design and style take off, and these long pages that are more narratives now, and stories, which I really like a lot about them. You'll see copies of them too. So how important is it to follow these trends, and even in
Parallax.
bigger companies where you have design patterns and libraries, and there's a certain consistency to it, and there's certainly convention that people understand maybe how an e-commerce, you know, flow works, and when do you break away from these things and do something different?
That's a great question. I mean, standard versus revolution that Theo was talking about.
Evolution versus
Like
revolution.
when do you break from that standard that people accept and say, forget that standard, I'm gonna create a new standard.
Well, doesn't this go back to brand though?
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, look at Apple, they break standards all the time. And it's accepted
Maybe a little
for some
too much.
reason.
Maybe
Yeah, I
a
have
little
no
more
idea
than
why.
that.
And then who are you, right? Your identity is the brand, because, you know, I work in the IT field. IT, you know, we're trailing behind. We're not setting any trends over here in terms of our design. They don't buy our product to have the latest icons and style. It's like, it's just function and form kind of comes with it. But that's completely different. I think in the agency world, I've worked with some, you know, like the culture, the Brookstones, who had a definite thing where they wanted to be seen as stylish and setting trends or cutting edge. And so where you go with it is a lot, it really does take it back to
Knowing what
who
fits
you
your
are.
brand and
Yeah.
who your audience is, yeah.
But now, and if I can ask, how do you know within that though, when to cut from, you know, establishing trends to really radically do something different? Even within a brand, there's times when you change.
Absolutely. It's kind of a simple answer, market share. You're gonna see, and Vesna raised the point of competition. I mean, when you're at the brand level, you know, it's all about staying differentiated and focused, but the competitive force is incredibly compelling. So, and you watch the numbers. I'm actually a client right now who's dealing with this exact problem. They have a very successful brand, start to lose market share, and they're just gone into total panic. So I know that they're gonna go back, and we already have, to the original principles of the brand. But the funny thing I'm finding now as someone who's so focused on content is I've got to the point where, you know, I'll get all this copy from people and I'm like slashing copy because people don't read anymore. So I like the flat design because I want to showcase video a lot
Focuses
of
on
the time.
content.
A lot of time I just want video. I mean, if people aren't reading, but they are watching video, that's where we're gonna go. So you always go back to the numbers and you go back to what people are doing, what they want to do.
Some of the things about the flat design is that, going back to psychology again, the user, Don Norman, who's kind of the father in our field, talked about affordances. Things we see that we know how to interact with something because it has affordances. Like you walk up to a door, you should know how to push, whether the door is a push door or a pull door. Well, at our conference we had in the fall, in the spring, same door handles were on different doors in the hotel, where some of them said push and some of them said pull. Those are bad affordances. And if you go too far on the flat design, you may take away some of the affordances. I can't tell if that's a label, a field, a link, a button.
A button, yeah.
If it's so flat and you can't distinguish between how I should interact with it, you've lost your affordances. So that's
But
why.
we work so hard with interfaces to build things that look like that,
Right, well,
so that people
again,
did understand it.
Skeuomorphism. You
And
make it look
now-
like a leather-bound
Right,
notebook.
yeah. But now people have done it so long.
Yeah, so we get them a totally flat design and they can't tell what's what on the interface.
So a lot of people raised their hand that said they're a graphic designer, lean that way as an interaction designer. Any questions from you guys or opinions about visual design?
Yeah, I think mobile is a huge thing with flat, and it comes down to those interactions, and, if you're not, Apple's, lucky enough to go flat because people know where buttons are and where interactions are, but, if they didn't, if that's their first experience, oh, that back button's a link, it's not a button, they're text links, and, so it's,
Yeah.
they're lucky to, and I'm sure they're gonna make improvements on it, but, for other companies that are also struggling with flat interactions, and I'd like to hear a little bit about maybe the mobile and how that affects your world and what you guys do.
There's something called mobile first, right? Think about the mobile user experience before desktop or TV or something
Well,
else.
in a lot of countries, that's all they have. So when you think internationally and localized other markets, that's their only device.
Right.
And the mobile first is often a development term more than a design term, but designers are kind of getting on board with that as well to a degree. This responsiveness. Everything I do nowadays, I'm always thinking about that and asking my clients how important it is. And sometimes they say it's not important to go into my business.
Well, let's
Show me
talk
the
about
numbers.
responsive design for a second, because we have game consoles, tablets, TVs, phones, desktops, and
Nobody
the
got
Internet of
phablets.
Things. that are
Now
coming.
tablets.
Is responsive design from a technical perspective, because good UI designers always accommodating for various resolutions and screen sizes, but now it's gonna, refrigerators, stoves, thermostats. Is responsive design really going to account for all that? Is that the way to go, or
Yeah,
do we need something novel and unique?
I think even before that, I think that's again a development term to make a paradigm that works, right? Not different size screens. I think it's even before that's content. So in the DoD space, even the Army and those guys are saying, we want tablets, we want phones, instead of these big, huge, heavy iron systems, right? And we keep asking why, and they don't know, right? And so we have to tell them. They just think it's cool right now because they think that's what the commercial world's doing, and they want everything mobile. And if you know anything about the military, they're not mobile. They have, Humvees full of
Except for when
equipment.
they want to invade a country, then they seem to get really.
Well, even then though, within that vehicle is a huge infrastructure of 10 different radio waveforms and all these computers and everything, and the soldiers barely fit. I mean, Humvee's small enough inside, but anyways. And so I think it's content. So we always ask the question, well, what do you want to display? Well, this is for a commander. Well, the commander needs to make decisions, right? So you don't need the map, you don't need the heavy-duty interface to make all these other decisions, to make a plane go this way and a soldier go that way and all this other stuff. You just need to make a yes-no decision. And it's really hard for them to lose that extra control that they once knew of this huge system, where they see everything and they can get Private Snuffy to show them all these really cool things that they don't even care or understand, because they're, captain, corporal, commander of something, right? Anyway, so I think it boils down to content more than a technology that makes things go bigger or smaller on the screen.
It's definitely content related. It's priority for me is what it's all about. It's like having, when I'm in a planning stage of a website, for instance, it's having things in a certain order and understanding what I believe at that time at least is going to be most important. And that's kind of what responsiveness is to me. It's in a word, it's a hierarchy.
For us, it went, the first thing is we tried to make it so our product, which is a web product, worked across browsers and different resolutions, but now mobile takes it to another level, and so it was just make it fit. No matter what you access on, you can get to the mothership. Yeah, that's step one, but really the next thing that mobile did for us is to start to partition that out and think, okay, now that we've accomplished that, which was kind of the obvious thing to do, if we were to break this out, the themes that you see in a Swiss Army knife, the beer drinker's Swiss Army knife that has the opener or whatever else in there, we start to think about our admins and what if we're going to take now some of the functionality and kind of pull it out as far as a theme, make this available through an app so they don't have to always log into that massive console. And they can very quickly get a few metrics, things that they look at all the time, or things that come up where I would, have to go log on to do it. Now I can quickly, redesign something that's really optimized for that mobile, make it a convenience. That's actually where some of the fun has come in. So that's kind of how we've looked at it. Great.
So I'd like to end the discussion tonight with the future. So I think it's a great time to be a UX designer, UI designer, interaction designer. I think more things are going to get connected and more intelligent and smarter, and there's going to be screens and voice recognition and gesture interfaces to play with. What is the role? What's the future role of the UX designer? Do we already know everything, or do we need to grow with the future? Where do we go next?
Well, I'll have to say, again, coming from automotive, there was 100 years of experience making cars, right? There's a reason why they still use clay, because it's aesthetic, it's visual, you can see it, it's right there, you touch and feel it, right?
Yeah.
And it's quick. If we don't capture, the experience of just people on the panel here for future generations, I think we're kind of at a loss. I don't think we need to keep iterating or developing new things. We need to do an iterative approach and kind of organically grow this, so that we have it's kind of like a pyramid, You got to build the base up before you get to the top. And I think we have the base right now.
One thing I'm hearing a lot, Lynn mentioned it when she talked about design thinking. So now design thinking is this, yet another term, another buzzword that elevates the role, I think, of UX designers to apply design and innovation processes to other business problems or situations. So she talked about the student experience, and yeah, there's a whole bunch of touch points that they're going to touch in that company, that brand, over their student experience. And some of those are going to be technology. Some slivers are going to interact with interactive products, but there's other things too. And I talked to another company that said, we're training everyone in our company on design thinking. They have 130,000 people in their company. I've never, ever heard something like that. And it's because they want to think differently and bring these alternative ideas and a different way to look at what they're doing, and to ask people, observe people, what are they going to do? How do we do things differently? Instead of just making a better interface, maybe we don't need the interface at all. And so they're changing that thinking. Is there a role that you guys as designers are going to play in this transformation? Because this one is going to be big, I think.
Absolutely. That's a big initiative of AIGA, is design thinking and applying that design thinking in other ways than traditional design. We've touched on it a lot with the things we're saying here. Traditional business thinking is come up with a solution first and then implement it. And what we're saying is we're going to throw out a ton of ideas, good ideas, bad ideas. We don't care. We're not married to that idea. And then we're going to prototype it and iterate it until we figure out what kind of works through practice, instead of hoping at the end it works.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, the design focus, I think, is important. In the last 6 months, I've had some conversations with IBM, and IBM is trying to change directions for this monster ship, where they've always been hardware has made most of their money, software is very low. They're trying to actually reverse those, and they've realized to do that, they need to do design thinking. So they've actually they hired Phil Gilbert, who's as a vice president of IBM of design across the whole company, which they've never done before. IBM has had so many huge variety of products,
Right.
but they've never had anyone try to focus on design across the whole corporation. So he's a vice president of design whose responsibility is every product in IBM. So they're trying to build a design center of excellence in Austin. They're taking the whole top floor of the building. They're hiring tons of people, but they also realize, as we're kind of saying here, that you can't forget about the experience of the knowledge that we've collected in our collective experience here.
Sure.
So that in addition to hiring grad students and other people, they're looking to get people like us as mentors who had 10, 15, 10, 20 years experience in the field to help these people get up to speed and to move forward. So part of the whole design thinking is not just getting everybody, but also not losing our history.
Absolutely.
And the experience we've got to get here. Like
Well, it has its roots in human factors and
moving
HDI.
from the desktop to touch interfaces. You know, you still the interaction. There's still human interaction has to go on there, whether it's a keyboard and mouse versus touch versus voice versus whatever's next.
Sure. I'd like to open it up to the audience. Any questions you might have for the panel? Person in the back. She went up first.
Yes, I wanted to ask whether it be the usability design, the interface design, any level of it. If you've ever had an executive, a client, somebody who pushed back and said, no, my idea's better.
No, that's
we ever
If they don't agree with you on the sciences, if they don't agree with you, because as you mentioned earlier about you can give the reasons why, you can explain why, you can source the data. If none of that flies, and you know they've chosen a route that is not going to be beneficial, how do you address that?
If it's green, it's going to be green. Right?
Exactly.
That's the idea.
I have a rule of thumb about that I kind of follow, and that is, first time, I'm going to fight for what I believe is right. Second time, I'm going to fight even a little bit harder. Third time, I'm going to get paid.
That's great.
And I probably won't work with them as much down the road. And that's how I do it.
That's not.
Yeah, I'm just going back to my question that was not answered, I'm sorry. That was about the education, because the education is really lagging behind where you are right now. Remember how I asked all of you where you're coming from? Because you came all from variety of fields, but they kind of converge into this kind of big umbrella of user experience design. So what can we do with, like in the education field to really educate the people so that they're ready for this world that you are in right now for future, because we're not there yet. And that's the question for all of you.
I think you can't educate someone to get all of our disciplines, to be at a high level of all of our disciplines. People still have to somewhat specialize. You're a visual person, a graphic person, a content person, but to be aware and to get enough understanding about the other roles and responsibilities, and to be good enough to understand. And if someone, like if a developer says, no, I can't do that, to be able to push back and say, yeah, I think you can, you just don't want to do it. But to know the other disciplines. But you're not going to get trained people to become an expert in all of our disciplines.
I think, I'm not sure if you're familiar, most people probably are, with the Elements of User Experience by Jesse James here. I think he was on the right track in terms of breaking down in layers kind of all of the foundational pieces that you do. There's skills around each one. And I think if you take that approach and not just kind of provide graphic design courses and communications and things, but actually talk about how these things go together. And then I think another piece is that all of us seem to have learned the most when we owned a project holistically. And we're either on that driving it ourselves or with a team, but I think giving projects in the nature of where it's either a group comes together or that person owns and has to work with multiple parties to put that into one output. That's the missing skill set for a lot of programs.
And you also mentioned that earlier with the kind of with all the skill sets actually you're looking for people, when they graduate from school, they need that poetry.
The one skill they need is they have to be able to play nice with the other children in the same class. We all have to learn. It's a team effort, and we all have to get along, and not say, I'm the guy who does this and you're not. But yes, you have to play nice with the other children.
But don't you think from a student perspective, you have to kind of direct them in their passion, right? And you have to start somewhere. I mean, we all started somewhere with a passion and then built from there and kind of were redirected.
A lot of schools don't have you working in teams, collaborating with each other, communicating. I think you guys said about the importance of being able, Tony, to talk to everybody. And a few VPs of design that I know that manage large design teams, they said they're great designers, but they can't talk business terms to business people. That's one of the most important skill sets that they lack, is the ability to interact and communicate and talk with a broad audience.
It's the
Lots
best
of
skill
parties
you
where
can
they get to
find.
mingle.
Question in the back, middle?
Yeah, Tony, when you were talking, you mentioned personas, and the last couple of days I heard some people talk about personas, and I was just wondering, in your guys' process, when does the persona enter the picture, and how often do you really reference that as keeping the user as part of the conversation?
Always.
Constantly?
Always, yeah.
Pretty soon, too. That's one of the first things you're trying to establish is who am I talking to? And how many different personas am I talking to, which can be a real problem.
So do you keep that like in a style guide or like a brand guide, or is that?
Sometimes that exists, but if it doesn't, you kind of make your own.
Well, General Dynamics being kind of a larger company, we send it out to everybody, not only for validation's sake, but buy-in and so they can consistently reference it. I mean, because a lot of times we'll stray way away from what the user actually wants. It's like, you remember last year when we built that persona for Sergeant whoever it was? Look at it, right? And then we'll bring that up again. It's always a living document for them. But it's the hardest thing to get in front of people at the same time.
Yeah, especially with the Agile process. I'm working in Agile too, and it's like crazy all the time. How do you keep it in there?
Print it. Like, it's fun to make. Print it and have it up in your cube or in your workspace, your team space, your pod. I mean, and that's the thing. It's just what they said. Sometimes you end up with arguing over things and just keep going back to that person. That's who you're doing it for. What would they want out of it? That's kind of an easy way to get user-centered, right?
I've
That's
seen
the
people
advantage
use
of
mannequins and get them at the desk and put the magazines that they read and show them in their
Little
working environment.
phone core people to sit at the conference table while you're
Yeah, exactly.
But you're absolutely right. That's what a brand does. That's what a persona does for you is when there's a conflict, it helps you resolve. It helps you say, it's a benchmark.
There's another question back there. Yes, go ahead.
Going back to the question before this last one about the skill set, lack of designers, many designers
process. Do you guys have any resources that would help designers having, just off the top of your head, or anything that you guys utilize, like, in terms of researching business and how that can work into like design and being able to reference it when you're dealing with
I'll suggest that you read the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis, because then you understand, or the Financial Times, if you're dealing with a global product, understand what's happening in the world. The Wall Street Journal, because economics tends to lead everybody by the nose these days, and politics, of course. So all of the permutations, all the context of the world in which you're designing, you better understand that. And Wall Street Journal does a great job of also dissecting the kind of challenges that all the brands are having. And actually, it's funny because I just got the Wall Street Journal delivered in its print form. I haven't read a newspaper in probably 10 years. And I read more of it in print form than I ever did online, which is really weird to me. But I forgot how helpful
It's
it
that
is.
tactile thing.
It's really
Yeah.
bizarre. I like read the whole thing.
It's a great user experience.
Yeah, it's unbeatable.
You know, Gardner, Forrester researchers, it's actually, so either one of those, or Gardner, you get the account and actually just start going to what interests you. Just start there. There's actually some amazing content, but they really are synthesizing a lot of that business data into the trending and into the interesting analytics, and it's actually a fun way to get into that. And that's where most of your marketing folks or in product management that are looking for strategy are feeding off of that stuff. So you get it at the source.
But use your own skill sets and go ask questions. We'll ask, I'm sure you guys have similar roles, whatever, the people you work with, but program managers or whoever that are, the people that are controlling the money, go ask them. Because they'll tell you flat out, the idea sucks, or we can't do that, or this is a great idea, go this direction. And they're more than open to help you out.
The mistake that I've seen a lot of designers make, including myself early in my career, is you go into the boardroom and talk about design, talk about your process and how wonderful it is. And these are guys that live by spreadsheets all day.
Yeah.
I saw a video on Don Norman said designers need to go into the room with spreadsheets and talk about all the money they're going to make for them. And people say, well, how do you do that? He says, well, that's what the marketing people do. They're just lying. So, it's about, you got to understand, this company I talked about, the large company that's changing the whole company and design, they're going to do that, but only where it makes business sense. They said, having easy-to-use products is wonderful, but I want to know how it makes money for my company. So you definitely need to learn how it translates into that. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go.
It's kind of a question, I think the fascination of the future of UX is really interesting because kids want to come out of school going into startups. They want to learn, they want to fail, and I know a lot of companies that are hiring are telling them to go do that. But there's the other problem, which I think Theo really addressed, is look, there's big corporations that don't have programs of design, and how do we get students into those that fresh idea, those fresh thoughts to help evolve those type of companies, I guess. I've worked with GoDaddy, and they're trying to make things a little bit different there and add a big design perspective. But so I don't know. It's comment / question. I was trying to figure that out.
Anybody on the panel want to address that?
Companies got to get it. They want to focus on design. Like we was talking about, they've got to get it. If they don't get design, then you don't really want to be a designer.
They got to value it. Yeah.
I think what's changing it too is the customers are starting to demand it, and competition's having an impact. So some company comes out of left field and designs a different product, a product that used to be a traditional product line in your company. And again, it gets back to the dollar. Boy, does that wake the company up. And they start asking questions. How did that happen? How did they do that? Where did they get there? And you see the answer increasingly being design thinking and design that made the difference. And so I think it's going to happen, and it's going to happen really fast over the next 5 years.
I think it's getting those people that can use design thinking at the C level in these corporations. Because that's what was missing. And then a company like Apple comes along and becomes the most successful company in the world when Microsoft was falling behind. And it's because they focused on design, really, and the user.
I think if you look at any company in the past 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, if they have some kind of public release where they said, hey, we promoted this guy to be a peer to everybody else, right, the VP level or whatever it would be, all of a sudden you notice that there's an uptick in that company's, valuation or whatever it would be. I mean, whether it's perceived or whether it's actual financial type thing. And so it's kind of interesting. I think that is the future. We're developing this profession, and we're starting to get people that are experts with a wealth of knowledge that we're starting to build off of, and those people are starting to be respected and moved up and moved up and moved up because they can see from a business side this uptick when another company doesn't.
Unfortunately, I just
Go ahead,
want to
Pamela.
comment on what you were saying, and that can't happen fast enough, because I find a lot of my colleagues, and myself included, have spent eons trying to educate people, and I don't suggest you educate them. I agree, you got to either get it or you don't. If you think there's merit in having a continued discussion with a client potentially, I would recommend keep it concrete. All the business gobbledygook, how much you hate it as a designer? Well, the business folks hate the designer gobbledygook. Even
they don't
something like,
understand it.
they don't
Hand-waving.
understand it. So, and you're maybe thinking you're showing off your expertise, and you are, but you've completely lost your audience. So keep it concrete, translate it into their language, meet them where they are, and tell case studies, particularly of the competition, as Wade said. So.
Case studies and analytics. We haven't talked about
Analytics,
analytics. We don't want, we as designers don't want analytics to drive the design. We want it to validate and confirm. If we say this design is better than the previous design, analytics should, if we're right, it should show.
Sure. You had another question back there? No?
No, and I have an answer for, sorry, it kind of got answered.
That's okay.
The Graphic Artist Guild handbook is a great handbook for business graphic designers or designers in general who kind of want to learn the business sense of. It's literally a physical book. Buy it at Barnes & Noble or order it online, and it gives you all the different terminology, how to write a contract, how to just go about graphic design or design in general as a business.
Graphic Arts Guild or AIGA. AIGA gives you contracts, there's just tons of resources that you can get on AIGA.org.
Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on Will's question about the startup versus corporation, and I know there's other students. So I work at one of those large corporations where we're lucky to have design thinking as a priority. I would say corporations want you. It's just that there's end ups, right? There's startups and there's end ups. So at the end up, they've got a structure, and the structure says junior this, senior that, principal that, and that scares off people without any experience. But don't let it. So they want young talent. They just have job titles that don't make sense for somebody in a recent grad's shoes. So my advice would be apply. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're not going to get an email. So,
What are the job titles that make sense?
badass. Like, I want a badass. So, all right, I'm a badass. So, no, I mean, I'm just saying. What I'm saying is, even my job title doesn't make sense. We're at an IxDA conference. I'm a UI designer.
Talking about UX.
And there was just a meeting last week about how we're all going to be UX people now, and we have to change our distribution list to say UX on it. Like, none of it matters. We just want good people that can move pixels around and talk to people. So, but my big thing is, if there's students in the room, don't be scared by titles. Even if all you get is an interview, that's something, because then you learn what they're looking for.
But if you want the title badass, you have to earn that. I'm not kidding. I don't even want that title.
What I've done is I just promote business cards.
Well, I say we have 5 badasses up here, and I'd like to thank them for being on the panel tonight. Excellent, and thanks everyone for coming.